in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome back to Sapio. Today, I'm back with my buddy here, Alan Biglione, Dr. Alan Biglione, ATU, as he would tell me. And today we're going to take off where we left off, which is the pillars of longevity and health span. And we're going to really start with some of the basic stuff, which is really related to diet and nutrition. So, Alan, welcome back.
Hey, it's awesome to be back.
Great, man. So we were, we kind of gave a big overview last time and stuff like that. But, one thing that comes to mind is people talk about longevity medicine and lifespan, health span, all this stuff that we're talking about now. But one thing that doctors have been doing for a very long time have been starting with this notion that, hey, got to have a good diet. You have to exercise. And I think what's interesting about what's changed is we've really narrowed down on that. And instead of it just being this blanket term, diet, nutrition, we've really kind of honed down on what that means. Yeah, I'm curious, in terms of med school, what did you learn about diet?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's not even a joke to say, but I would probably say 1 or 2 classes on nutrition. Exercise too. So these are broad categories that you hear about: diet, exercise, nutrition, right?
Right.
But I didn't get any deeper understanding other than what the macronutrients are and the biochemistry behind that. But we got no deeper understanding as to how these actually play into health and wellness.
Well, and I think a lot of it's because we didn't really know per se, right? There's certainly some ideas. Well, these foods are good for you, these are not good for you. But I remember, and I remember telling you this, that obviously you're my physician now, but I had a physician before you. He was a really smart guy. It's a guy in town who was there forever and was up on the literature and stuff like that. And I remember asking him specifically about intermittent fasting, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And he looked at me and said, "Oh, it won't hurt you." And but really, it's all about calories in, calories out. And that was sort of the mantra that I think that we all kind of grew up in this, medical training. And really, so no one really got that much from medical school. And I don't know if that's changed. I doubt it has. But that's where we're starting. So in reality, what we do know, though, is that nutrition, diet, whatever you want to call it, I mean, this is critically important before you even jump into all the interventions and supplements and so on and so forth. So why don't we just jump into it first and foremost? Let's talk about sort of diet. When you think of diet as it relates to, this topic, how do you break it down?
Yeah. Well, I mean, fundamentally, diet refers to nutrition we bring into our body, right? And how that plays into health and wellness, man, this is one of the major pillars we talked about. You really can't talk about longevity without diving into diet, right? So fundamentally, the way I think about it is in terms of 3 pillars, right? So
3 pillars within this pillar.
3 pillars within this pillar.
Okay, got it.
And really, I mean, none of these exist in a silo. So I think it's almost naive to say that one domain is the solution. And I mean, this kind of comes right back to kind of the major theme that we're talking about is there are many, many different ways to optimize longevity. But what are these domains? What are these pillars within this primary domain? We have caloric restriction, right? Okay. So this is kind of what's classically entailed. Classically entails decrease in your total caloric intake. I don't care what your calorie breakdown is. We're just going to decrease the total number. Classically, this is sort of the paradigm of calories in, calories out, right? And it's wrought with error. I should say incomplete knowledge. So number 2, timed restriction. And we'll go into all of these, right? And timed restriction is something that we're both very fond of, including intermittent fasting. And then the third one, which kind of gets into the diet fads, this is dietary restrictions.
Yeah. So it's basically, so how many calories, when to eat, and what to eat.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? That's basically it. So all right, let's start with the first one, which you mentioned was calories, right?
Yeah.
So I just mentioned a second ago, calories in, calories out. If you were looking at it from that perspective, the question's always going to be, okay, well, how many calories then? So how many calories, doctor?
Yeah, so good question. And this comes up all the time. I mean, 1800, 2000 is a reasonable maintenance. Bigger people require more, smaller people require less. But
2,000 calories
yeah,
is not very much food,
you
though.
can go through that
Yeah.
dramatically quickly
Yeah.
if you're not eating well,
Yeah.
right? So, this gets into a more fundamental question too, as if you're gonna have 2000 calories of junk food, what's your health span? What's your lifespan?
Hmm.
Right? So 1800 calories of nutrient dense food is very different than 1800 calories of Snickers bar, right? Of one of many examples.
Right. Right.
But that's a benchmark. So I kind of consider that as a flat line. And then if you're at a steady state and you're consuming 1800 calories a day and you want to lose weight, then you need a caloric deficit. You need to subtract from there. If you
Yeah.
want to put on muscle mass, you need to add from there. But that's a benchmark that I think
Yeah.
about.
So going back to but going down this point though, that just seems like, 1,800 to 2,000 calories a day. I mean, who's even counting that stuff, right? And I'm not
Yeah.
counting it. Maybe some people, if you're at Weight Watchers, they do it. But the reality is,
Yeah.
if you're not gaining weight or you're not losing weight, you're probably
You're at a
eating the
steady
right
state.
amount of food. And if
Yeah.
you want to lose weight, in the big
Yeah.
picture, you're going to eat a little bit less. So this is not brain
Yeah.
surgery. I
Totally.
used to
No.
do a little bit of that, so I
Yeah.
know. Um, and
Uh,
and basically what you're trying to do then is figure out like what works for you. Now, but it's not just about calories, like we talked about before. It's not about just calories in, calories out.
yeah.
There's other things that are involved. Like for example, we talked a little bit about when to eat,
Mhm.
right? And again, you could
Mhm.
say, well, as long as you 2,000 or 3,000 calories, whatever, if I ate it,
Yeah.
all throughout the day in small feedings, maybe
Right, right.
that's better than
Yeah.
one big lump sum. But we're actually finding that there is some importance to this.
The
I'm going to
time.
address that a little bit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Oh, so one sentence here. The basal metabolic rate for our body's ability to utilize fuel is nonlinear. If I consume, imagine this, you're intermittent fasting and you have one or two big meals a day. What if I'm doing those two meals at 8 o'clock at night and 10 o'clock at night? That's terrible.
Mm.
Our metabolism is very slow evolutionarily in the evening. So it's nonlinear. Um, so one thing to think about is the timing of your caloric intake. Um, Carbohydrates, for instance, so that our body's ability to utilize carbohydrates and store them efficiently, i.e., this is metabolic function, is a lot better earlier in the day. So if you've ever heard your doctor or someone say, after dinner, you shouldn't consume any calories, let your stomach flatten out. I mean, there actually is methodology to that. And eating carbohydrates, for instance, we'll get to this in more detail, right before bed is a death sentence. It's a metabolic death sentence.
So it's not only that though. It's like, you mentioned fasting, right? And this is
Yeah.
something with quite a bit of evidence behind it. There's this, people talk about intermittent fasting, and this
Yeah.
can take many shapes and forms, actually. I think the two most common ones, the most common one I think that people I know is something that's similar to what I do, which is really called time restricted feeding, where basically you're
Yeah.
taking your meals and you're condensing them into, somewhere between 6 to 8 hours of the day. And that, of course, we're not taking into consideration at this point, what you're eating or so on and so forth.
Mhm.
But doing that alone
Mhm.
seems to have some significant benefits. And that could be related, probably is related to some of the overlying themes that we've talked about before, which is hormesis. If the body thinks
Mhm.
it is, uh, having some sort of trauma or some sort of thing, it's battling in the sense of
Yep.
whether it's running out of food or heat or cold or something like that. Some of these mechanisms turn on gene expression of protective genes that
That's right.
help you to potentially, protect yourself from disease and death.
Yep.
So that's presumably one of the,
Yeah.
big examples of benefits of time-restricted feeding, intermittent fasting.
Oh,
You
yeah.
want to comment on?
Well, what you're getting at is there's a natural stress response. Being slightly hungry without being famished to the point where it actually keeps you up at night, but being slightly hungry is analogous to a cold response or heat response, but it induces the expression of stress hormones. Stress hormones, transcription factors, gene regulation, sirtuins. I mean, we'll get into all of this, right? But the concept is the same. Slight stress on your body upregulates certain pathways which are involved in longevity.
This is actually a big
Mm.
deal, and people should, I would suggest that, people look into this as an option. And again, going back to the different
Mm.
options, so there's a 6 to 8 hour a day window. Another common one is a 5-2 approach, which is known as basically 5 days of the week. You eat whatever you want,
Yep.
or not whatever you want, but you eat normally
Yeah.
in a healthy sort of way. And then you have 2 days where you're only eating one meal a day, about 500 to 600 calories. And that sounds a lot harder to me, so I don't do
Yeah.
that one. But
Hmm.
what's interesting to me, though, again, is going back to the protective mechanisms that seem to be activated. You mentioned, like, the sirtuins or AMPK, mTOR, these things. They, they seem to. We do see some actual evidence of that in the literature. Thinking and memory
Yeah.
improvements. We've seen that. Heart health, lots of improvements in
Hmm.
blood pressure, resting heart rate, other related stuff like that. Type 2
Yep.
diabetes, not a surprise there, right? If you're eating
Absolutely.
less, probably, obviously, what you eat makes a difference. In obesity, you're probably going to eat
Totally.
less if you're in a window.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about insulin resistance, though, because that's
Mm.
one of the things that the intermittent fasting
Mm.
seems to have an effect on. And why is that
Yeah.
important?
Well, insulin resistance is, I mean, it correlates to obesity and also correlates to diabetes, right? So that's why it's relevant. But when you have excess adipose tissue, when you have excess fat cells in our body, those release cytokines and those create what we call metabolic dysregulation. Our body essentially doesn't know what to do with sugar loads. You eat sugar, you eat carbohydrates, and we're talking about patients that might not even have much of that. But you have a sugar load, it goes into your bloodstream, and your body doesn't have the ability to pull it into cells.
Yes. So
So
normally it's
that's
done
exactly
through the action of insulin.
insulin. Yeah.
And if the cells are less sensitive to insulin,
Yeah.
they're less able to ultimately do their job, which is to bring
Spot on.
that sugar into the blood.
Yeah.
And that's bad. And
That's
that's bad.
bad.
High blood sugar is bad. So
Yeah.
insulin resistance is sort of like the term we use to describe the ladders up to diabetes,
Yeah,
so to
type
speak.
2. So this
Yeah.
is not a problem with the pancreas per se. It's a problem with the signaling pathways to remove sugar from the blood.
Other stuff that intermittent fasting could potentially help with, according to the literature, I'm just reading stuff off here, but there's evidence of reduced tissue damage from surgery, improved results after surgery.
Mm.
Another one I thought was
Healing.
really fascinating was there was a study in JAMA, the oncology edition,
Mhm.
and Journal of American Medicine, and that was showing that women who had breast cancer, that those women who slept or who fasted overnight, meaning basically the amount of time between
restricted.
dinner and
Yeah.
and breakfast and stuff like that, if that fasting period was over 13 hours, they were much less likely, statistically less likely, to get recurrences in breast cancer. And again, that goes
Yeah.
back to what we were talking about
Yeah.
before, which is it may be more than just helping with insulin sensitivity and all that. There may be an overall, what we call a geroprotective effect, which is
Yeah.
an effect that actually increases longevity by having the body's protective systems go up.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of it's not like super hard evidence here, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider. Let me ask you this. If you had to make one statement about diet, like eat this, don't eat that, what would you tell us?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, this is what we know. Carbohydrates are extraordinarily inflammatory. Carbohydrates can create a lot of damage if they're not handled properly in our body. Now,
Give us some examples of that, because this is important. If
Oh,
we say
for sure.
carbohydrates, we're basically talking about
Yeah.
simple sugars here,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, there's complex carbohydrates too. Carbohydrates, so really, carbohydrates get broken down into glucose, right?
Mhm.
I mean, fundamentally, sometimes a 2 polymer and gets absorbed into
Mhm.
your bloodstream. But if you think fundamentally glucose, all carbohydrates break down into simple sugars.
Mhm.
And to use an example, what about even something as benign as like a fruit juice,
Mhm.
right? Orange juice. So you're taking fruit, you're crushing it up and you're consuming it, and you get an extraordinarily high glycemic load into your bloodstream. And this is profound for our body. I mean, the signaling cascades go crazy. We remember the theme is we have to upregulate insulin, which is not necessarily a good thing evolutionarily, even for cancer, by cancer risk, I should say. But you're creating this inflammatory cascade that your body has to deal with from a sugar load. That's one example. Other examples could be rice. Other examples could be potatoes. Other examples could be whole fruits. But don't take that the wrong way, because fruits are weaved into whole fruits, organic whole fruits are weaved into high fiber casein. So it doesn't actually get into your blood to the same degree. So it doesn't actually do the same damage.
So basically, I would just, I mean, my take on this is basically that simple sugars are the enemy.
Yeah,
It is important
processed
too,
sugars.
because I know you
Yeah.
mentioned a lot of things have sugar in them, but I mean, if you're
Yeah.
sure the sugars in broccoli are not the same as
Yeah,
sugars
cellulose.
in,
Yeah.
you know, these are
Yeah.
totally different kinds of things. So
Yeah.
sugars that you're getting from that are complex carbohydrates, typically they're broken down much
Yeah.
slower, and they don't
And
have
that's
an
a key thing.
impact on the blood sugar going way up and way down.
That's a key thing.
However, you know,
Yeah.
some of these, as you mentioned, things that we used to
Mhm.
think were really good for us, they're not real good for us.
Yeah.
Like again, you know, freshly squeezed orange juice sounds great, but that's going to create a big pop in
Yeah.
blood sugar.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny when it makes me think about it. So going back to this idea that sugar is the enemy,
Mhm.
right? When I was a kid, I remember it was like in fifth grade, and we were doing nutrition in fifth grade, and so sometimes it's better not to teach something
Than
know,
to teach just a little
than to
bit.
teach us.
Yeah.
Well, no, to teach what we thought back then, which
Yeah.
was totally wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, because I don't know what you know what you were learning at that point, but back in those days, we were
Mhm.
learning the food pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the food pyramid is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh
So.
yeah.
Right. What's at the bottom? What the most you're supposed to eat is carbs.
Right.
And then above that was, proteins, and then,
Just
fats
a
at
little
the
bit
very
of fats,
tip.
bad,
And what
bad,
we
bad.
end up finding is it's
Yeah.
completely upside down. This is kind of an interesting story, because I think it's a time when medicine really failed us. Because if I think the New England Journal of Medicine, I think, did some study on, or did some, there was something I read in there a long time ago. But basically, they went back and they looked at why this paradigm existed. And it turned out some of the main studies that showed this lack of linking between cardiovascular health and sugar was funded by the sugar industry
I'm not
at the
surprised.
time. Did you hear about that?
No.
So it was,
Yeah.
and then the other thing that was horrible about that was one of the main authors on those seminal papers was a major contributor to ultimately what became the food pyramid.
Mm.
And so
Yeah.
basically some deceptive, company stuff that
Yeah.
probably really, really put the country on a horrible course
Yeah.
towards diet.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. So I'm not surprised by hearing
Yeah.
that like there's inside motive. That doesn't surprise me.
Okay, so we know that, glucose and blood sugar is the enemy, but how do you even know you got a problem?
Yeah, you got to test. So you can check fasting insulin levels, sensitive way to see if your insulin is on the rise. If you're insulin resistant, your insulin levels will rise. You can check hemoglobin A1c. It's a 3-month marker. You can do an oral glucose tolerance test where you give somebody a high sugar load and you look to see how their body brings it down over time. But there are ways to identify
Okay, well,
this.
let's
Yeah.
do one of those, but one of the major, I think,
Yeah.
you could get a fasting blood glucose, which is basically you come in, you're fasting, and you're seeing like how much is your baseline when you don't eat or anything like that. And that might give
Yeah.
you like a little insight. If it's, over
Mild.
100, plus, then it might be a problem. But that only tells you like one time in history, like one little snapshot, little photo. You mentioned
Totally.
something else, which
A1c.
hemoglobin A1c. Tell us what that is and why that's important.
Yeah, hemoglobin A1c is it comes as a percent, and it's basically sugar bound to hemoglobin.
Mhm.
Hemoglobin is the pigment in red blood cells.
Mhm.
Red
And
blood
sugar,
cells,
this stuff is sticky.
very sticky. So
Mhm.
really, you can correlate the amount of stickiness on a red blood cell to your average blood sugar
Mhm.
over the course of 3 months. Why 3 months? Because that's how long a red blood cell lives. right? So it can correlate to average blood glucose. It doesn't tell you ups and downs and spikes and divots. It
Yeah.
doesn't give you the day to day or the hour to hour, minute to minute, but it gives us an idea, snapshot.
But then actually that's like
Yeah.
a lot more useful information because
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
you're seeing is like the effect or the stickiness of sugar to one specific protein, in this case, the hemoglobin.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
it's what you're looking at and saying, well, if there's more sticking to this, there's more sticking to everything.
There's more in the body.
Yeah, there's more in the body and it's sticking to everything,
Yeah.
hurting everything, right? So the hemoglobin A1c, what are like the typical numbers on that? What does that,
Yeah.
what does that look like?
So remember, it's a correlation. So A1C is 6.5 correlates to an average blood sugar over 126, which is the definition of diabetes.
Okay, so 6.5
Yeah.
is diabetes.
6.5 is diabetic by
Okay.
definition,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And then below that, do you just say, hey, I'm 6.49, I'm good?
You remember, I mean, the world doesn't work in
Right.
hard absolutes, but 5.6 to 6.4 is pre-diabetic by definition.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is part of the problem. We have somebody at 5.7, they're diagnosed as prediabetes, 5.6, 5.5. We don't even think about them.
Yeah. And should you? When should you? I mean,
Yeah.
like I had this conversation literally with a friend today, who had a
Great question.
A1C of about 5.6.
Mhm.
History of diabetes in his family, type 2 diabetes
Yeah.
is very heritable.
Yeah.
He's early 40s, hyperlipidemia as well.
Mhm.
So when you look at a guy like that, 5.6 doesn't sound like a great
Yeah,
number,
I would
right?
agree. I
Yeah.
mean, to be honest with you, 5.2 and above, my eyes go to them.
Okay.
If they're right around that margin and they have other risk factors, you should definitely pay attention to it.
And this is really important too, Alan, and
Mhm.
this is because the way you treat is the way we're advocating that hopefully more physicians will start doing it. Because listen, when
Yeah.
we're taught medicine, literally, what did you used to do when you were like a resident or something like you just, go through those labs and you see which ones are bolded, right?
Yeah.
And you stop
Yeah.
at those. And if you're only going there when
Yeah.
something is like, bolded, that may not be enough. You may need to catch
I
things at an
agree.
earlier time so you don't have issues.
Yeah.
So, okay, so 5.2. That's a good start. So maybe if you're a little bit over 5.2, then you need to start paying attention. But in the meantime, there's other things that you could do. Say you're 5.3 or above, you could potentially start the intermittent fasting. That potentially can help
Yeah.
with insulin sensitivity,
Yeah.
which we talked about, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things you could do. There's also ways to actually check your own blood glucose because we're not living in 1925 anymore, right? Like
Yeah.
so tell us about that.
Yeah. What you're talking about, Buck, is a continuous glucose monitor.
Yeah.
We're not living in the 1960s, 50s anymore. However, you do need a doctor's prescription. You can't go out and just get one. But these are small little devices you put on your shoulder. Libra 3 is what I just utilized. I believe you've had it too. But we're talking about 2-week continuous glucose sensors, real-time data.
Thing that I found really interesting about continuous glucose monitors was that this idea that, sure, we have an idea what affects people in general. Like we have glycemic indices that show that certain foods will spike your blood sugar more than others.
Yeah.
But actually, what's really fascinating to me is it's not the same for everybody.
It's not the same.
And that is where the power of sort of this personal medicine and what we're doing these days is. I found in my case, like that certain foods that were supposed to be highly, supposed to have a high glycemic index, meaning they affected that spike more, made you have a bigger spike, actually really didn't do much to me. Like rice
Yeah.
didn't do very much to me.
Right.
But for some reason, Thai food in general was absolutely miserable. It went, which was kind of
World trying
sad
to tell you something.
because I like Thai food. Another thing that I noticed that is I had a dinner like like a regular dinner that was not super high glycemic. Like I went out for had a steak actually and salad, a steak and salad and stuff like that. And then that day, because I don't really, my lines are not really hard on stuff. I know what I should do, but I like dessert. Sometimes
Yeah.
out with my kids, I had dessert. And I looked at my blood sugar and it didn't spike at all.
Uh-huh.
And so what that told me is if I have a decent meal and then I have something sweet, then it might not hurt me quite as much as I thought.
Yeah.
Sequencing on food is
I like
really
that.
important too, and useful stuff to know about. Like, for
Yeah.
example, we get bread at the table first.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually something that probably you should be eating after you've had your salad, right?
Yeah.
So,
Ironic.
what was your experience like with continuous glucose monitoring?
Well, it's a way to personalize medicine, and it's a way to identify how metabolically healthy you are. My insights were, I have, being Italian, I have this weakness for Italian food. I have this weakness for pasta,
Oh, yeah.
right? So I had my margarita pizza, and I watched it go crazy. Now, I'm not diabetic. My insulin went up and brought it down rather quickly. I did the same thing a week later, but to your point, I had a salad first, and it peaked at 140 rather than 180 or so.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty dramatic, right? So there are ways to almost biohack this,
Yeah. And
right?
speaking of which, another
Mhm.
thing, we'll just throw them out here because,
Yeah.
you're going to hear, I think the way to think about this show is you're going to hear a lot of the same concepts over and over again. And so if you're not catching every piece of what we're talking right now, don't worry about it. They're going to keep coming back over and over. Talk about some of the diets because I'm sure you run into people asking you about
Yeah,
that.
I mean, really, everybody's just looking for the one magic fix, right? There's Atkins, there's plant-based, there's keto. Those are the common ones. We have paleo, which we hear quite a bit about. But one broad category too is the Mediterranean diet,
Yeah.
which as doctors, by the way, that is something that we do learn about.
Yeah.
But yeah, patients come in and they ask you, what should I do about this? What should I do about this? And what I say is kind of what we talked about. I think carbohydrate restriction is great, and that kind of goes along the lines of an Atkins base. How much or how many carbohydrates your body requires, it's not quite that simple. That's why I really like this CGM data to help personalize that. You can
Yeah.
actually see where you are in a window.
I think the big problem with the Atkins one, though, like that kind of diet, is it is you're not eating any vegetables really, are you? I mean, I don't know the
Yeah,
diet
it's really
exactly,
about
but
carbohydrate restriction, more so than vegetable restriction. So the non-soluble carbohydrates like
okay, so you can
vegetables,
eat those.
yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, you should. I mean, that's really a major hack.
All right,
Yeah.
but I remember with when this was big, people were sitting there, eating bacon and all sorts of, fat and,
Yeah.
and they thought it was all good for them. I mean, what do you make of
Yeah.
that? Is that
I mean, this comes up all the time. It's just not that simple. Saturated fats are not good. Lots of data shows that implicates the coronary disease and other problems too. So high fats isn't necessarily bad. Good fats exist, polyunsaturated fats like
so like
olive oil.
avocados?
Right,
Fat comes
avocados.
from
This is part of the
avocados,
Mediterranean diet.
fish oil,
Yeah.
fish oils.
So the beautiful thing about a Mediterranean diet is that it doesn't encompass just one of those diet fads.
Mhm.
It's about healthy organic, and it's about plant-based as much as you can, and about lean meats. It's sort of a hybrid of all of them. But fats are not the enemy, and sugars too. I mean, really, I would say point number one, processed sugars, high fructose corn syrup are terrible, right? But in your case, you had complex carbohydrates that didn't negatively affect your body in a terrible way. You're metabolically efficient. You can actually handle a certain amount of carbs. You might not need to cut them all out.
Yeah.
And that's what keto is, complete cessation to drive fat utilization. So this is what I would say in one liner. It doesn't have to be that complex. It has to be sustainable, right? So you have to have something that you will adhere to. If it's too dramatic and it's too restrictive and it's too exclusive, you may succeed, you may not, but it doesn't have to be that hard.
Yeah. And I think just to sum up this issue, and we can, is to say that none of this is going to be useful if you approach it as an all or none type situation.
Yeah.
Because I know that guy who's trying to turn 18 again.
He's trying to reverse the
And he's
clock.
got a
Yeah.
bunch of stuff. And it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting to watch. I'm not,
Yeah.
making fun of him or anything. But I can tell you that looking at what he's eating on a daily basis, I mean, I don't want to live that life, right?
Seriously.
It's just not interested in that.
Yeah.
So ultimately, what we're trying to do here is to create some level of baseline knowledge. It doesn't mean you have to be so dogmatic about everything all the time. Take what works for you,
Yeah.
and just just be well educated in the matter. And I mean, that's more than the vast majority
I
of
love
people in
it.
the country.
Yeah, keep
So,
asking questions
yeah,
and see what works for your body,
yeah,
right? What
yeah,
works for you doesn't necessarily work for me,
yeah.
right? So if you do something and it doesn't work, it's not right for your body.
So, Ben's our producer here, and one of the things I asked Ben to do because Alan and I are just going to talk, and a lot of times we will start talking about things without really backing up and
Yeah.
understanding that not everybody who's listening to this is a physician. So Ben, you're not going to be on camera here, but let's. What do you got for us?
Okay, I do have a couple questions. The first question is, how do I get started? Like, should I go to my doctor and get my baseline levels, or what should I do?
I think that's a great place to start. Sometimes the answer is under your nose, right? If you're going to do anything and you're going to restrict something, you want to know what you're dealing with before you just start throwing Hail Marys out. There is stuff that are in general favorable, and that's kind of the stuff that we talked about. But we live in a generation now where you can actually personalize these things.
Yeah, I think the thing too is like try to figure out, and I hate to say this, but like if you're interested in this kind of medicine, this kind of self, um, you know, not do it yourself, but rather taking it into your own hands type of medicine, you're going to have to find a provider who's actually okay with that, and who's going to be supportive of that because not a lot, I mean, a lot of them are not still, and it's not their fault. It's just, the way medicine is right now is, people are very busy. Reimbursement and stuff makes it so you have to see thousands of patients, just to just make a living.
Yeah,
And
I know.
guys like Alan,
Yeah.
Alan has a concierge medical practice that limits the number of patients he can have, and he can really focus on this. But there's also, I think, just in general, a willingness that you're going to need from your provider, to be in tune with this stuff, and rather than just be one of those people that says, don't worry about it, come back when, something really bad happens.
Okay, second question I have. You talked about limiting the hours you eat in a day. That might make me want to skip breakfast.
Yeah.
But you also talked about your metabolism being active more early. So is there a conflict? Should I be skipping breakfast, or I
So most of the time when I'm doing what I want to do, my restriction is somewhere between 6 and 7 hours. Um, and I typically won't have lunch till about 1 o'clock. So that gives me till, 7 or 8 to potentially eat. Now, in my case, what I'll do, and Alan can comment on that timing as day-night stuff, because I don't know that literature very well, but I think ideally you want to stop really eating or drinking potentially about 2 hours before going to bed. So you don't have to go pee at night too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, there are
talk
several.
about the timing though. What were you
Yeah.
saying?
So you're commenting on the sentence that I said about basal metabolic rate, our body's ability to handle macronutrients,
Yeah.
and it's non-linear, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that the earlier the better. At 8 o'clock in the morning, you've got to shovel in all my food, right? But I say that more in terms of after dinner, our body is going into pre-bedtime hibernation mode metabolically.
Hmm.
And that's why, we talk about all the timed restriction diets.
Hmm.
None of them are back heavy. None of them have your bulk calories right before you go to bed.
Yeah.
And that's
I mean,
unanimous.
time restricted
Yeah.
feeding doesn't usually, when people talk about it, they don't usually give like a specific time, right? But theoretically, I think you're right. I think if it's earlier, it's probably better.
Yeah.
But I think for me, certainly it's just easier to have it later in the day because of the way our culture
Yeah.
works. Your social dinner, your social time is that dinner, and catching up with the
Yeah.
kids and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think your point is well taken. I think, the whole adage of not eating right before you go to bed is a very real one. I mean, that's, your metabolic rate's going to be very slow then.
It's going to sit
And you
there.
also don't want to like, give yourself a big spike blood sugar right before bed. I
Yeah.
mean, that sounds like a bad idea. So
Yeah.
as we go along with the pillars, and we will reveal them one by one. But the next one, what we're going to be talking about is the second pillar, which is basically exercise, right? Which is something you know a lot about, and
Yeah.
so it's not something that I know a lot about. So it'll be interesting. I'm going to ask you a
Yeah.
lot of questions about that. But we will do that next show. Alan, thanks for coming though.
Thanks, Buck.